Dylan Rodriguez, the political logic of the nonprofit industrial complex. Perhaps never before has the struggle to mount viable movements of radical social transformation in the United States been more desperate, urgent, or difficult. In the aftermath of the 1960s mass movement era, the edifices of state repression have themselves undergone substantive transformation, even as classical techniques of politically formed state violence, colonization, and proto-colonial occupation, racist policing, assassination, political and mass-based imprisonment remain fairly constant in the U.S. production of global order. Here, I am specifically concerned with the emergence of the U.S. prison industrial complex and its relationship to the nonprofit industrial complex, the industrialized incorporation of pro-state liberal and progressive campaigns and movements into a spectrum of government-proctored nonprofit organizations. In my view, these overlapping developments, the rise of a racially constituted prison regime unprecedented in scale, and the almost simultaneous structural consolidation of a nonprofit industrial complex have exerted a form and content to U.S.-based resistance struggles, which enmeshes them in the social arrangement that political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal names an industry of fear. In a 1998 correspondence to the 3,000-plus participants in the conference Critical Resistance, Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex, he writes, Americans live in a cavern of fear, a psychic, numbing force manufactured by the so-called entertainment industry, reified by the psychological industry, and buttressed by the coercion industry. The social psychology of America is being fed by a media that threatens all with an army of psychopathic, deviant, sadistic madmen bent on ravishing a helpless, prone citizenry. The state's coercive apparatus of public safety is erected as a needed protective counterpoint. I wish to pay special attention to Abu-Jamal's illustration of the social fabrication of fear as a necessary political and cultural condition for the rise of the U.S. nonprofit industrial complex, which has, in turn, enabled and complemented the massive institutional production of the U.S. prison industrial complex. As I understand it, the NPIC is the set of symbiotic relationships that link together political and financial technologies of state and owning class proctorship and surveillance over public political intercourse, including and especially emergent progressive and leftist social movements, since about the mid-1970s. Abu-Jamal's Cavern of Fear illuminates the repressive and popular broadly racist common sense that both haunts and constitutes the political imagination of many contemporary progressive, radical, and even self-professed revolutionary social change activists. Why, in other words, does the political imagination of the U.S. nonprofit and non-governmental organization enabled left generally refuse to embrace the urgent and incomplete historical work of a radical counterstate, anti-white supremacist, prison penal slave abolitionist movement? I am especially concerned with how the political assimilation of the nonprofit sector into the progressive dreams of a democratic global civil society already presumes existing structures of social liquidation, including biological and social death. Does Abu-Jamal's Cavern of Fear also echo the durable historical racial phobias of the U.S. social order generally? Does the specter of an authentic radical freedom, no longer structured by the assumptions underlying the historical freedoms invested in white American political identity, including the perversions and mystifications of such concepts as democracy, civil rights, which is to say a collapsing of the very socio-cultural foundations of the united racist liberation of black, brown, and red bodies, no longer presumed to be in state-ordained bodily violence and domestic warfare that logically threatens the very existence of the still white-dominant U.S. left? Perhaps it is, in part, the left's fear of an unleashed bodily proximity to currently criminalized, Colorado-nized, and normatively violated peoples that compels it to retain the staunchly anti-abolitionist political limits of the NPIC. The persistence of such a racial fear, in effect, the fear of a radical freedom that obliterates the cultural and material ascendancy of white freedom, is neither new nor unusual in the his, is fundamentally designed to maintain brutal inequalities in the putative free world, is symbiotic with the policing and incarceration of marginalized, racially pathologized communities, as well as the state's ongoing absorption of organized dissent through the nonprofit structure. While this alleged left frequently considers its array of incorporated, legitimate organizations and institutions as the fortified bulwark of a progressive social justice orientation in civil society, I am concerned with the ways in which the broad assimilation of such organizations into a non-profit industrial complex actually enables more vicious forms of state repression. The velvet purse of state repression, it may be appropriate to initiate this discussion with a critical reflection on the accelerated incorporation of progressive social change struggles into a structure of state accreditation and owning class surveillance since the 1970s. Robert L. Allen's classic book Black Awakening in Capitalist America was among the first works to offer a sustained political analysis of how liberal white philanthropic organizations, including the Rockefeller, Ford, and Mellon Foundation's facilitated the violent state repression of radical and revolutionary elements within the Black liberation movements of the late 1960s and early 70s. Allen argues that it was precisely because of philanthropy's overtures toward the movement's more moderate and explicitly reformist elements, especially those advocate ing versions of Black capitalism and political self-determination through participation in electoral politics, that radical Black liberationists and revolutionaries were more easily criminalized and liquidated. To Allen's account, which appears in this collection, proves instructive for a current critique of the state-corporate alliance that keeps the lid on what is left of Black liberationist politics, along with a cohort of radical struggles encompassed by what was once called the U.S. Third World Left. Perhaps as important, Allen's analysis may provide a critical analytical framework through which to understand the problem of white ascendancy and liberal white supremacy within the dominant spheres of white nationalist organizations, and the proliferation of racially formed juridical measures to criminalize and imprison entire populations of poor and working-class Black, brown, and indigenous people has been and continues to be a fundamental legacy of this era. Responding to the liberation movement era's momentary disruption of a naturalized American apartheid and taken for granted domestic colonialism, a new coalition of prominent owning class white philanthropists, lawmakers, state bureaucrats, local and federal police, and ordinary white civilians scramble to restore the coherence and stability of white civil society in the midst of a fundamental challenge from activists and radical movement intellectuals who envision substantive transformation in the very foundations of U.S. society itself. One outcome of this movement toward white reconstruction was the invention, development, and refinement of repressive policing technologies across the local and federal scales, a labor that encompassed a wide variety of organizing and deployment strategies. The notorious counterintelligence program of J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigations remains the most historically prominent incident of the undeclared warfare waged by the state against domestic populations, insurrections, and suspected revolutionaries. But the spectacle of Hooverite repression obscures the broader and far more important convergence of state and capitalist philanthropic forces in the absorption of progressive social change struggles that define this era and its aimlessness among our youth, anxiety among our elders, and there is a virtual despair among the many who look beyond material success for the inner meaning of their lives. Security from domestic violence, no less than from foreign aggression, is the most elementary and fundamental purpose of any government, and a government that cannot fulfill that purpose is one that cannot long command the loyalty of its citizens. History shows us demonstrates that nothing prepares the way for tyranny more than the failure of public officials to keep the streets from bullies and marauders. 3 On the one hand, the subsequent exponential growth of the U.S. policing apparatus thus closely follow the white populist political schema of the Goldwater-Nixon law and order bloc. For law and order was essentially the harbinger of white reconstruction, mobilizing an apparatus of state violence to protect and recuperate cantly encompassed white supremacist desire for surveilling, policing, caging of dissidents organized and disarticulated, radical and proto-political. In this historical context, COINTELPRO's illegal and unconstitutional abuses and has generated a popular consensus around its modes of dominance, punitive racist criminal justice, paramilitary policing, and strategically deployed domestic warfare regimes have become an American way of life. This popularized and institutionalized law and order state has built this popular consensus in part through a symbiosis with the nonprofit liberal foundation structure, which, in turn, has helped collapse various sites of potential political radicalism into non-antagonistic social service and pro-state reformist initiatives. Vast expenditures of state capacity, from police expansion to school militarization, and the multiplication of state-formed popular cultural productions, from the virtual universalization of the tough on crime electoral campaign message to the explosion of pro-police discourses in Hollywood film, television dramas, and popular reality shows, have conveyed several overlapping political messages, which have accomplished several mutually reinforcing tasks of the white Reconstructionist agenda that are relevant to our discussion here. The staunch criminalization of particular political practices embodied by radical and otherwise critically dissenting activists, intellectuals, and ordinary people of color, this is to say, when racially pathologized bodies take on political activities critical of U.S. state violence, say, normalize police brutality, homicide, militarized misogyny, or colonialist occupation, or attempt to dislodge the presumed STA or progressive anti-racial violence campaigns, they are subjected to the e.g. terrorists, rioters, gang members, and therefore as essentially opportunistic, misled, apolitical, or even amoral social actors. The fundamental political constriction through everything from restrictive tax laws on community-based organizations to the arbitrary enforcement of repressive laws banning certain forms of public congregation, for example, the California anti-gang statutes that have effectively criminalized black and brown public existence on a massive scale, of the appropriate avenues and protocols of agitation for social change, which drastically delimits the form and substance that's socially transformative in light of the veritable explosion of private foundations as primary institutions through which to harness and restrict the potentials of U.S.-based progressive activisms. Heavily dependent on the funding of such ostensibly liberal and progressive financial bodies as the Mellon, Ford, and Soros foundations, the very existence of many social justice organizations has often come to rest more on the effectiveness of professional grant writers than on skilled, much less radical, political educators and organizers. A 1997 Atlantic Monthly article entitled Citizen 501 states, for example, that the net worth of such foundations was over $200 billion as of 1996, a growth of more than 400% since course of events in the United States and the world, has made foundations one of the handful of major actors in our society, but they are the one that draws the least public attention. As the foundation lifeline has sustained the PIC's emergence into a primary component of U.S. political life, the assimilation of political resistance projects into quasi-entrepreneurial, corporate-style ventures occurs under the threat of unruliness and antisocial deviance that rules Abu Jamal's U.S. cavern of fear. Arguably, forms of sustained grassroots social movement that do not rely on the material assets and institutionalized legitimacy of the NPIC have become largely unimaginable within the political culture of the current U.S. left. If anything, this culture is generally disciplined and ruled by the fundamental imperative to preserve the integrity and coherence of U.S. white civil society, and the ruling class of philanthropic organizations and foundations may, at times, almost unilaterally determine whether certain activist commitments and practices are appropriate to their consensus vision of American democracy. The self-narrative of multi-billionaire philanthropist George Soros, whom the PBS program now described as the only American citizen with his own foreign policy, brings candor and clarity to the societal mission of one well, Soros's conception of the open society, fueled by his avowed disdain for laissez-faire capitalism, communism, and Nazism, privileges political dissent that works firmly within the constraints of bourgeois liberal democracy. The imperative to protect and, in Soros's case, to selectively enable with funding dissenting political projects emerges from the presumption that existing social, cultural, political, and economic institutions are in some way perfectible, and that such dissenting projects must not deviate from the unnamed values which serve as the ideological glue of civil society. Perhaps most important, the open society is premised on the idea that clashing political projects can, and must be brought into a vague state of reconciliation with one another. Instead of there being a dichotomy between open and closed, I see the open society as occupying a middle ground, where the rights of the individual are safeguarded, but where there are some shared values that hold society together. I envisage the open society as a society open to improve only to our mental constructs, but also to our institutions. What is imperfect can be improved by a process of trial and error. The open society not only allows this process, but actually encourages it by insisting on freedom of expression and protecting dissent. The open society offers a vista of limitless. The open society merely provides a framework within which different views about social and political issues can be reconciled. It does not offer a firm view on social goals. If it did, it would not be an open society. Point 10. Crucially, the formulaic, naive vision of Soros's open society finds its condition of possibility in untied foundation purse strings, as dissent flowers into viability on the strength of a generous grant or two. The essential conservatism of Soros's manifesto obtains common sense status within the liberal progressive foundation industry by virtue of financial force, as his patronage reigns hegemonic among numerous organizations and emergent social movements. RKS EVING ever is whether this enabling also exerts a disciplinary or repressive force on contemporary social movement organizations while nurturing a particular ideological and structural allegiance to state authority that preempts political social movement theorists John McCarthy, David Britt, and Mark Wolfson argue that the channeling mechanisms embodied by the nonprofit industry may now far outweigh the effect of direct social control by states in explaining the structural isomorphism, orthodox tactics, and moderate goals of much collective action in modern America. 12. That is, the overall bureaucratic formality and hierarchical structuring of the NPIC has institutionalized more than just a series of hoops through which aspiring social change activists must jump. These institutional characteristics, in fact, dictate the political vistas of NPIC organizations themselves. The form of the U.S. left is inseparable from its political content. The most obvious element of this kinder, gentler, industrialized repression is its bureaucratic incorporation of social change organizations into a tangle of incentives, such as postal privileges, tax-exempt status, and quick access to philanthropic funding apparatuses made possible by state bestowal of not-for-profit status. Increasingly, avowedly progressive, radical, leftist, and even some self-declared revolutionary groups have found assimilation into the state-sanctioned organizational paradigm a practical route to institutionalize a operational infrastructure while avoiding the transience, messiness, and possible jests and historical movement away from direct, cruder forms, toward more subtle forms of state social control of social movements. 13. Central to this sublimated state discipline and surveillance are the myriad regulatory mechanisms that serve to both accredit and disqualify nonprofit social change groups. The Internal Revenue Service, tax laws of individual states, the U.S. Postal Service, and independent auditors help keep bureaucratic order within and the political lid on what many theorists refer to as the post-1960s emergence of new social movements. McCarthy, Britt, and Wolfson conclude that this historical development has rather sweeping consequences for the entirety of civil society. Another consequence of the growth of this system is a blurring of the boundaries between the state and society, between the civil and the political. Our analysis suggests that a decreasing proportion of local groups remain unpenetrated by the laws and regulations of the central state. Some analysts see civil space declining as the result of a fusion of the private and political by the activists of the new social movements who politicize more and more civil structures in the pursuit of more comprehensive moral and political goals. Our analysis views the construction as more the consequence of state penetration of the civil, and the consequences in more traditional terms a narrowing and taming of the potential for broad dissent. 14. The NPIC thus serves as the medium through which the state continues to exert a fundamental dominance over the political intercourse of the U.S. left, as well as U.S. civil society more generally. Even and especially as organizations linked to the NPIC assert their relative autonomy from and independence of state, a shadow state crystallizes the symbiosis between the state and social change organizations, gesturing toward a broader conception of the state's disciplinary power and surveillance capacities. According to Woolch, the structural and political interaction between the state and the nonprofit industrial complex manifests as more than a relation of patronage, ideological repression, or institutional subordination. In excess of the expected organizational deference to state rules and regulations, social change groups are constituted by the operational paradigms of the NPIC as political epistemology, the co-optation of political imagination literally, a way of knowing social change and resistance praxis that is difficult to escape or rupture. To revisit Abu Jamal's conception of the U.S. cavern of fear, the nonprofit industrial complex has facilitated a bureaucratized management of fear that mitigates against the radical break with owning class capital Reed might otherwise be posited as the necessary precondition for generating counter-society. In other words, tend to be respected and institutionally assimilated by as the distance between state authority and civil society collapses, the civic spaces for resistance and radical political experimentation disappear and disperse into places unheard, unseen, and untouched by the presumed audiences of the nonprofit industry. Arguably, the most vibrant sites of radical and proto-supremacist civil society are condensing among populations that the NPIC cannot easily or fully incorporate. Organized, underorganized, and ad hoc movements of imprisoned, homeless, and undocumented people, as well as activists committed to working beneath and relatively autonomous of the NPIC's praxis that displaces the NPIC's apparent domination of political discourse and possibility. Such a revitalization of radical political vision is both urgent, and NEC displays of violence and impunity seem to imply that authentically radical Chowlungs to its realms of domination are all but doomed. Of the Iran-Contra scandal in the mid-1980s, one also finds resonance with the state's attempts to preemptively contain and liquidate political disorder through the white supremacist criminalization and mass-based incarceration fostered by the Reagan administration's simultaneous initiation of a war on drugs. As the prison and policing apparatuses began to flower at the pinnacle of the Reagan-Bush bloc, so the culture of terrorism provided a context for their reproduction as the Vietnam War escalated through the stages of subversion, state terrorism, and outright U.S. aggression, disaffection, and protest among the public became a significant force, preventing the government from declaring the national mobilization that would have been required to win what was becoming a major war. The general dissidence, particularly among the youth, was perceived in elite circles as a serious problem by itself in 1968, while within the Pentagon, there was concern that sufficient military force be held in reserve to control lick escapes from passivity, it must be deceived, for its own good. 16 into a dependent relation with the neoliberal state and philanthropic foundations. This is not to suggest that a pure autonomy from state authority and discipline is attainable, but rather to argue that resistance and counter-hegemonic organizations dismantle the possibility of radical antagonism as they move into closer proximity to independence on the centers of state power and capital. Woolch suggests several critical dimensions to this dynamic of reduced autonomy. 1. The state will force voluntary groups to plan reactively in response to new state policies and practices. This is in contrast to enabling groups to plan proactively, to decide on their own goals and objectives and how to. Contracts and grants will increasingly come with requirements for stringent, rigid, and quantitatively oriented approaches to planning, evaluation, and 3. Those organizations unable to meet the expanding demands for planning will become increasingly marginalized and may not be able to secure state fund ing. Such standards for organizational practice will have structural effects, controlling the rise of anti-establishment social movements and pushing marginal groups to produce direct services instead of advocacy outputs. 4. Newly formed groups may be jeopardized by new government funding programs. 5. There may be little room for voluntary sector development and new initiatives. Community services, the ability of the voluntary sector to develop innovative approaches to social problems, may be severely inhibited. Group activities may become aligned to funding agency needs and expectations for types of change toward direct services administered by professionals and away from advocacy and participation. 18 Under current circumstances, organized dissent movements and organizations in the United States are often compelled to replicate the bureaucratic structures of the small business, large corporation, and state, creating centralized national offices, gathering political celebrities and luminaries onto boards of directors, and hiring professional activists whose salaries depend activists, scholars, writers, and intellectuals who are enmeshed in the disciplinary restrictions imposed by the NPIC. What are the inherent limits to the vistas of social change or transformation mandated by the U.S. left's incorporation into the NPIC and its emphasis on career organizational security? Should the NPIC itself be conceptualized as a fundamental target of radical social transformation? Can people struggling for survival, radical transformation, and liberation outside the tentacles of the NPIC generate new grassroots, community-based, or even underground structures and institutions capable of sustaining movements against the U.S. RAC state and white supremacist civil society? Beyond the PIC, the lessons of anti-colonialism and decolonization, as this anthology attempts a critical and material intervention on the political stasis generated by the non-profit industrial complex, we can and should recall the recent history of socially disenfranchised and oppressed Black and Third World peoples whose demands for liberation and radical freedom have represented, for white civil society, the specter of its own undoing. Because I have observed a peculiar dynamic in the current political landscape that makes political fodder of this liberationist legacy. With increasing frequency, we are party to a white liberal and multicultural, people of color liberal imagination that venerates and even fetishizes the iconography and rhetoric of contemporary Black and Third World liberation movements, and then proceeds to incorporate these images and vernaculars into the public presentation of foundation-funded liberal or progressive organizations. I have also observed and experienced how these organizations, in order to protect their non-profit status and marketability to liberal foundations, actively self-police against fact, an authentic conspiracy of collaboration among philanthropists and state officials, including local police and federal administrators, to dissipate the incisive and radical critique of U.S. white supremacist capitalism, the white supremacist state, and white civil society that was spreading in the wake of domestic, Black and Third World liberation movements. What Allen does not explicitly state, although he does imply, is that the rise of the white liberal philanthropic establishment had lasting political effects that ultimately equaled the most immediate repressive outcomes of COINTELPRO and its offspring. It is the paradigm-shaping political influence of the post-1970s white philanthropic renaissance that remains the durable and generally underanalyzed. My point, at the risk of stating the historically obvious, is that the prototype of the white liberal and now ostensibly multicultural, though still white, continues to facilitate the violent state-organized repression of radical and revolutionary elements within the Black and Third World liberation movements of the late 1960s and early 70s. As well as what remains of such liberation-struck society that I discuss above is not simply a relationship of convenience. It is ascent movements may take place under penalty of militarized state repression, a political violence that has, through the pedagogical work of the state, one of whom I am implicating here. I am not speaking narrowly of the openly conservative and the establishment left unanimously agree are fundamentally reactionary, or humanist, and humanitarian liberal progressive foundations that this very same establishment left relies on, that is, the same foundations that often fund this NST disenfranchisement, suffering, and death of those populations who are targeted for containment and political, social liquidation, a violent social order produced under the dictates of democracy, peace, security, and justice that form the historical and political foundations of the very same white civil society on which the NPIC left is based. If we take seriously, for the sake of argument, the political analysis articulated by Palestinians struggling against the Israeli occupation, or that of imprisoned radical intellectuals, activists, and their free world allies desperately fighting to dismantle and abolish the prison industrial complex, or that of indigenous peoples worldwide who, to paraphrase Haunani K. Trask, are literally fighting against their own planned obsolescence. 20 Then it should become clear that the Soros philosophy of the open society, along with other liberal foundations social imagi neris, are at best philanthropic vanities. At worst, we can accuse the Soros, Ford, Mellon, and Rockefeller foundations, and their ilk of NGOs and non-profit organizations, of accompanying and facilitating these massive structures of human domination, which simply cannot be reformed or reconciled, in a manner that legitimates anything approaching a vision of liberation or radical freedom. While many professional intellectuals, community-based social change organizations, non-profit progressive groups, student activists, and others in the establishment left pay some attention to the unmediated violence waged by state formations on targeted individuals and communities, the implicit theoretical assumptions guiding much of this political intellectual work have tended to pathologize state violence, rendering it as the scary, illegitimate offspring of a right-wing hegemony. The logical extension of this political analysis is the notion that the periodic, spectacular materialization of direct relations of force are the symptomatic and extreme evidence of some deeper set of societal flaws. In fact, the treatment of state violence as a non-essential facet of the U.S. social formation is the discursive requirement for the establishment left's strained attempts at political dialogue with its more hegemonic political antagonists, whether they law and order common sense, 21 that remains the most under-theorized diamond shown of contemporary struggles for social transformation. A generalized climate of defensiveness, political retreat, and pragmatic anti-radicalism perm attache the current critical discourse, such that the political and historical ground ceded to the punitive state and its defender advocates mitigates against the flow airing of new and creative knowledge productions. Antagonistic, radical, and proto-radical political practices spurred by the desire to resist and abolish the normalized violence and undeclared domestic warfare of the American state remain politically latent and deeply criminalized in the current social formation. While the establishment left conceptualizes its array of incorporated entrepreneurial, non-profit 501 organizations and NGOs as the fortified command center of progressive social justice movements within civil society, I remain constantly disturbed by the manner in which this political apparatus, the NPIC, the establishment left's commitment to maintaining the essential social and political structures of civil society reproduces and enables the most vicious and insidious forms of state and state-sanctioned oppression and repression by way of my previous examples, typological white supremacist domination of the colony. The colonizer historically and prototypically, the categorical white man to whom many such theorists refer ultimately found the native indispensable, and not just because he could siphon and steal the native's labor and other natural resources. The native's indispensability was found, rather, in his her bodily presence, which was not ing less than the affirmation of life's materiality for the settler. Memmi contends that it was through this very presence that whiteness found its form of articulation, its passage from the realm of the imaginary to the grittiness of material relation. Of the settler white man, Memmi writes, he cannot even resolve to avoid them. He must constantly live in relation to them, for it is this very alliance which enables him to lead the life which he decided to look for in the colonies. It is this relationship which is lucrative, which creates privilege. Point 2 the white colonizer was consistently unsettled by the movement between the two primary requirements of the white colony and its underlying processes of conquest, the extermination of indigenous human societies and the political cultural naturalization of that very same process. Memmi expounds on the dynamic and durable relationship between these forms of domination, ultimately arguing that the containment and strategic elimination of targeted populations is inseparable from the global ideology of Euro-American colonial domination that posits its sites of conquest as infinitely, naturally, available for white settlement. Here, we might think about the connectedness between Memmi's definition of the colonial power relation and the current conditions of possibility for white civil society in the alleged aftermath of the colonial epoch. The forced proximity between settlers and natives, or white civil society, and its resident aliens, entails a historically persistent engagement between categories of humans generally defined by the colonizer as existential opposites. This entity it has constructed, that is, contrary to more vulgar theorizations, The colonizer is not simply interested in ridding of the colonized, breaking them from indigenous attachments, or exploiting their bodies for industrial, domestic, or sexual labor. Memmi's colonizer also desires an antisocial human relation, a structured dialogue with the colonized that performs a kind of autoerotic drama for the colonizer, a production of pleasure that both draws upon and maintains a distinct power structure. Settlers. Truth is that which hurries on the breakup of the colonialist regime. It is that which promotes the emergence of a nation. It is all that protects the natives and ruins the foreigners. In this colonialist context, there is no truthful behavior, and the good is quite simply that which is evil for them. 23 Truth, for Fanon, is precisely that which generates and multiplies the historical possibility of disruptive, subversive movement against colonial oppression. The evident rhetoric of oppositionality, of the subaltern good, that necessarily materializes evil in the eyes of domination, offers a stunning departure from the language of negotiation, dialogue, progress, moderation, and peace that has become hegemonic in discourses of social change and social justice inside and outside the United States. Perhaps most important, the political language of opposition is premised on its open-endedness and contingency, a particular refusal to soothe the anxiety generated in the attempt to displace a condition of violent peace for the sake of something else, a world beyond agendas, platforms, funding structures, and practical proposals. There are no guarantees or arrogant,